All right. William, Molly, again, thank you for being here. This is super exciting to be able to chat with you about your studio, your culture, your team, a little bit about Manifold Garden and what you're working on next, and obviously your open roles as you are currently hiring. So let's just get started with a little bit about each of you. William, let's clear the stage and allow Molly to kind of jump in. Molly, who are you? Tell us a little bit about your kind of background, and then we'll kick it over to William.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Nate and Catherine and Will. It's such a pleasure to be speaking to everyone who's here today. I am new to the games industry. I joined William Chyr Studio almost 6 months ago as the new operations director. My background is in arts administration, so for the past decade, I've been working in not-for-profit and for-profit arts institutions, many of which have been startups, and I've been working in kind of a crossover role between arts administration, program administration, and a lot of operational duties. So this is definitely a change for me, but I'm very excited to be working with William and with the studio itself. William and I go way back, so we met probably almost a dozen years ago when Will was working on some of his art installations, and that's how we met. And we've stayed in touch over the years as Will started to make the game and all of that. So although I am new to the games industry, I have known Will for a long time. So it's just a pleasure to be working on this project with Will and with Will again in this capacity. So that's a little bit about me. Thank you.
Awesome. Well,
yeah, I've been in games industry now for about 10 years, a little over 10 years. Started with Manifold Garden which I started making Manifold Garden in 2012, so almost 10 years. By the way, is the audio okay? Are we good?
sorry, yeah, we're not actually hearing you on Zencastr, so Zencastr might not work for us. Will, we could just we could unmute Will here on Discord, and we'll just roll that way. Sorry, Will, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I've been in games for about 10 years now. Prior to that, I was an installation artist. I was kind of doing these large-scale balloon installations, and I think at the time I was looking to change mediums and started. Yeah, a friend of mine showed me the movie Indie Game the movie, and I kind of watched it. And I thought, hey, I can.
Fantastic, yeah.
It romanticized the process a bit, and I think made it seem a little easier. And I thought, hey, I can try doing this. How long can it take? Three months. So I, installed Unity and started making these. I wrote the first version over Thanksgiving weekend 2012. And then 7 years later in 2019, we finally shipped it. It's done very well for us. And, we're now kind of in that next stage, which is building a studio before we start the second game.
That's great. I love that Indie Game the movie tricked you into joining the game industry. It tricked you with romanticizing and your false assumptions on how much of an effort that would take. Thank you. There's a lot of good that came out of that movie. There's another one. So Molly, this is really interesting. I love. By the way, I mean the art background, right? So we're talking about you're coming from the art world. You say you've not been in games, but games has been an art, right? So I don't think you're actually changing industries, right? It's still the same industry because we are delivering art. Games is art. It's just a different, form. It's a different shape. But what a lot of us here are doing or aspiring to do is to share our art with more appreciators, right, through our medium of video games. So I love the crossover here. What actually let's stay on that. What are some of the other similarities, Molly, that you actually see between games and art? And then Will, I'm gonna have a question for you about your decision to actually bring Molly on the team, given that so many job descriptions are asking for X number of years experience in the video game industry, right? And Molly's coming from outside the industry. So I'd love your perspective on why and how to recruit Molly onto the team, and what unique benefits that you think the team and the players of your games are going to enjoy because of Molly's kind of outside perspective.
Thanks, Nate. And I think you really hit the nail on the head. It's, what exactly is the art world or the art industry? When I speak about being an arts administrator, I'm speaking primarily about having worked in the fine art world and the performing arts world as an arts administrator. So, but what disciplinary, what discipline is performance versus art versus games versus new media art? Those are all, shifting questions that continue to be part of the discourse of around art. So I think, yes, exactly. It's all very much combined. And having worked with creatives and primarily in support roles, supporting artists, I find it to be extremely similar. As you mentioned, it's a lot of the same structures and processes, collaborative processes, creative processes, working with fine artists and performing artists. I'm seeing already working with the team at Chyr Studios. So it's a lot of the same similarities that are there. Of course, in the fine arts and performing arts, you have different economic models as well. You have, not-for-profits that involve fundraising, and, for-profits that involve market, the art market. So there's a lot of different economic models, and the combination of the different type of model, economic model, combined with the combination of the different art form, whether it's a collaborative art form like you find in the performing arts mostly, or a solo artist working in a studio, that is, depending on those arrangements, the operations that support those artists and those organizations and entities tend to be very different. But a lot of it is very similar to what I'm seeing working with the game studio with Chyr Studios so far. We have a lot of collaboration. We have a collaborative team working with creatives. We have different, structural models and financial models. So it's very interesting to be working in this new creative industry and with continued support for artists and creatives. And I think one of the things that is, really similar about, let's say, the art world and the game world, is that they're passion-driven industries. So, most of the people are coming to work in the fine arts or performing arts because, whether they're administrators like myself, or artists, or curators, or art handlers, they're coming to work in that industry because they have a love for the thing itself. And I think with the games industry, it's very similar. People are usually coming to work in that industry because they have a passion for the thing itself, much like the culinary industry. And so these what I like to think of as passion-driven industries, have this wonderful creative energy. There's a lot of commitment. And then there can also be a lot of precarity, a lot of uncertainty that is also a part of these industries as well. And I think from an operations perspective, taking all of that into how we create a structure to support that is, what I enjoy exploring, but also, something that I feel is really important for sustainability, both for the organizations and entities themselves, but also for the workers that are involved in these entities and organizations.
I love all that. I'm going to stay here for a minute. So Molly, my mission in games later in it's still early in my career, but later in my career, when I started to work with more and more small developers. Early in my career, I was just working with kind of big AAA, and then later in my career, it was mostly AAA again. But when I started working with hundreds of indie developers, I really started to appreciate, their need, like their physical need to get their art into the world. Right? And that was one thing that, me on the business side, I'm not a creative, I'm a creative business person, but I'm not a creative. Me on the business side, I then had that need to help them get it out into the world. And then not just that, you just talked about sustainable, right? A sustainable studio, sustainable not just for the studio or the game, but for the individuals. Then once I solved, or uh, um, uh, once I found, wanting like to get art out into the world, get somebody's art out into the world, then it was like, okay, well, what else is going on here? And these people, a lot of these, like, they have families, right? They have to, put food on the table. A lot of these studios are living, I call it kind of paycheck to paycheck, right? It's not that much different because they were living game to game, right? So the other thing that I wanted to do was not just help them get their art into as many hands, as possible, but in doing so, make them more financially successful so that they were then sustainable. They had better lives, happier lives, more fulfilled, less stress-free lives, at home, in the studio. And then if they're not living game to game, they could actually take more risks and be more innovative, and really bring the games, that they're almost afraid, to bring to us, and really bring those games out and share them with the world. So there's a lot of kind of a symbiosis, I think, here. I really appreciate, kind of your perspective of, wanting to help the creators bring their art into the world in a really healthy and sustainable fashion. So thank you, Molly. Will, do you want to give us a little bit of insight on why hire Molly? Why go against the grain and hire somebody from outside the industry, and what do you think that is kind of unique about Molly or the outside perspective that is going to benefit you and the team?
Sure. I think one thing to first, I want to mention that we're a Chicago-based studio, and I think that's relevant because Chicago doesn't have a large games industry. It did, Midway was here, Bungie was started here, but really, I think in terms of AAA presence, there's Iron Galaxy and NetherRealm making Mortal Kombat, and I think
Right.
Disbelief as well. So it's we don't have that anchor studio like Ubisoft in Montreal, or just that presence, right? Microsoft in Washington or the LA area. So there's not a lot of talent here. In a lot of ways, this has been, and I think it's when it comes to art, when it comes to comedy, Chicago's always known as the place where people get started and they move away to New York, LA. It's like
Right.
Chicago is the place to be if the place you want to be is New York. Everybody
Yeah.
comes here, they go through Second City, then they move away. And but the small scene here has actually been to my advantage. I've gotten to know a lot of people, Young Horses, who made Octodad and Bug Snacks. They're here in
Right.
Chicago. They've been big mentors to me. And so even though it's a very small scene, you kind of get to know a lot of different people. And after we released Manifold Garden, a lot of people that kind of joined the team, there was a core team, I think about 7, 8 people that released, they all joined towards the end. And I think at that point, Manifold Garden had a very clear identity. It's almost like it's a train, and we know what the where it's going and kind of what we need to do to get there. After the release of that game, though, it's completely different. It's like we're now figuring out, where are we going? Are we gonna take a car or a plane? Or do we have to build that? Like it's a completely different entity that we're dealing with. And I remember we had a lot of sort of struggles because I think after Manifold Garden, we immediately jumped into game 2, not recognizing that the releasing a game is completely different than starting a new one. And when I
Right.
started Manifold Garden, that was 4 years by myself, kind of wandering in the desert. And I spoke with Josh Sway, who worked at Midway back in the day. In fact, he was the face of Sub-Zero in Mortal Kombat 2. This is someone who's been in the industry for 20 years. And I said, I kind of need this help with the business side. And I'm at the time I had thought I should I can hire other creatives and give them feedback while I take on all the business administrative side, which is completely backwards because the creative side is really what I'm good at. And he said, you should, hire someone else to do that. And I said, well, but how am I going to find an operations person in Chicago? We just don't have that big of an industry. And he said, you actually don't need someone in games to be in operations, but you do need someone with that experience. Like just knowing, how to make a game, the difference between Unreal and Unity, that's less important than someone who's familiar with payroll, who's familiar with accounting. And so Molly and I, we've known each other, I think 13, 14 years. I've always known her as a, director of arts organizations, administrator. And I know that she's, you know, has a lot of experience running creative organizations. And I felt that that is something that's there. I see a lot of similarities. And we
Mm-hmm.
kind of randomly got together for lunch and started talking. I just felt really right. I was like, this is just exactly what Josh was telling me about. And it's definitely, bringing Molly on has been the best decision uh, in 2022. And I think this has been a big appeal for people who are applying for jobs because there is that separation of power, right? We're saying like we actually for a long time just had 3 employees. There's myself, creative director, Tyler, our technical director, and Molly, our operations director, which is a bit of an unusual combination that a third of the company is actually not actively involved in games in the
Mm-hmm.
game development itself. But this was also something that Mike Bithell of Bithell Games made. Thomas Was Alone. He's working on a new game with Tron. He was a big inspiration because I remember many years ago, after the release of Thomas Was Alone or Volume, he brought on a biz dev partner, Alexander Slewinski, who used to write for Joystick. And I thought that's an unusual partnership. Usually I see an artist or a programmer getting together, or artist,
Right.
programmer, designer. Those tend to be the indie team combinations. And here Mike is bringing another person to do business. But I think that as I talked to him, Alex really provided a lot of the studio support that built the foundation to kind of help him focus on the creative stuff. And I thought that's exactly what we need here.
Absolutely. I think that's really key there, William, in that your anytime that you're not spent making games, right, is well, I'm not going to say it's like not time well spent, but there's a lot, like we're going to get a lot of return and a lot of enjoyment, a lot of joy out of you making games, right, versus being stuck in business or administrative tasks. I often tell people here, right, as they're applying for indie companies, and maybe they don't always hear back promptly, or maybe their interview process is a little bit bumpy. Those are things that we try to help out with, but we also want to understand that the person often that is interviewing is also the CEO of the company, who's also probably the lead programmer or animator, might also be dabbling in audio, is also negotiating contracts with the first party, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So you hiring somebody, seeing that and hiring somebody to take all of that, kind of off your hands so that you can then really focus just on making great games. I love that. One of the reasons that we try to make work with indie super easy to work with, right? It's like, because you have a game to make, right? Give us your links. We'll post all your jobs for you. We'll send it out everywhere we can. And we'll try to recruit for you. We then give you the other problem of a lot of applicants to sort through, but trying to make it really easy on you so that you can do what you do best, which is make a smile through the games that you're creating. All right, let's talk a little bit more about kind of Manifold first before we start moving forward. So working as a solo developer for 4 years, that's intense. At what point did you know that it was time to ask for help? And how did you first go about assembling that team? Anybody else currently on the team that was part of those original group of collaborators? And then I guess any lessons that you learned about building a team from that experience that you're taking into this current experience?
Sure. Initially, yeah, it was me for the first 3 4 years. I think at some point we got funding from Indie Fund. It wasn't a lot of money, but enough to bring other people on.
Yeah.
One of the challenges we had though was because we didn't have enough to pay people, they weren't staying for very long. So it was that it was like 3 4 years alone, and then I think about 2 years where it was just sort of this rotating door of people. Um, Coming in and out. I think the core team that really coalesced and shipped Manifold Garden came together in 2017. And I think the first person was Arthur, our graphics programmer. And he had found me on Twitter. I'd been posting a lot about the game. I would stream development during develop. I was streaming development
Mm-hmm.
for about really, I think from 2016 until release. So a lot of people kind of knew about the game and they were like, oh, can I work on this? So I used to not have job posting. We just post something on Twitter that like, hey, I'm looking for a programmer. Send me an email. Fortunately, we really lucked out with Arthur, and he was incredible to work with. But from there, like Martin, our sound designer, joined. Larissa, our composer, and we still collaborate with a lot of the same people. Tyler, who's our current technical director, in fact, joined towards in the last year of Manifold Garden development, originally just to help us with the PS4 port. That was all
Mm-hmm.
he was planning to do. He ended up taking over ports for the other platform. We worked with other, external contractors as well, but he sort of took over maintenance of that, had a big hand in the Apple Arcade version, and now is handling everything from the build machine to our version control system to the architecture of the new game. In terms of lessons, in the past, we used to hire people based on three things. Were they available? Did they have the skills? And could we afford them? And I think one of the things we've learned is like that is good when things are going well. I think I've heard this phrase like winning teams don't argue. And it's sort of, there's the momentum of things going well to
Right.
kind of carry things. And you sort of don't look at, you kind of ignore a lot of the issues. But what happens though, is if you don't have a good foundation and something goes wrong, then it all comes falling down. And so for us, a big focus is, when Molly joined, one of the first things she did was having us sit down, talk about our company values. And there was a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of resistance. Not people weren't against it, but this was like, oh, this feels like a corporate exercise.
Yeah.
It's kind of meaningless. Who doesn't want integrity or respect? But as we talked about it, it really we really got to understand what those words meant and how they apply to us. And they've been these pillars that we can point to and say, for example, one of the values is flexibility and independence. And we used to have this check-in at the end of the day at 5 p.m. because some people, especially sort of like junior programmers, maybe weren't as proactive in letting us know about these issues. So we thought,
Mm-hmm.
okay, hey, let's have this meeting at 5 p.m., 5-10 minutes. So, we can ask people if they were stuck on anything. But it kind of meant like you had to sort of be home at that time. If you started working on something at 4:30, you had to stop it to jump on this call. And we found that, well, if people are just proactive, if they are independent, then we don't need that meeting. Like the studio can be more flexible if people are independent. And so that's a question that, we've actually changed policies by asking ourselves, does this fit our value? And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's been something that's been really, really great for us. So part of our interview process now is really getting to know the person, getting to know if they're going to be a good fit culture-wise, and then focusing on the skill set second.
So culture first, skill set second. Would you you mentioned like the three things that you did hire for? Would you hire somebody today that was available, right? Was excellent, right, at their craft, but wasn't a culture fit? Would that be in consideration?
No, I would rule that out just because there are a lot of people applying. I think we can find someone. Like we're not asking for a whole lot here, and I think we can find someone that fits those. Because what I found is, if someone isn't a good culture fit, that can really cause problems later on, and I think that can be more detrimental in the long run.
Yeah, that was a leading question. Thanks for I just softballed that up for you. You knocked it out of the park. There's a lot of reasons that we might not get that offer, right? Folks that are interviewing for roles might not get an offer, and it's not always, your skill set. It's not always your ability. And culture fit is incredibly important. I think for any team that we want to be a part of for the long term, we want to fit in that culture as well. We want to add to that culture, but we want it to be a good fit for us, because just as it would cause long-term issues for the company, for the studio, it's going to cause long-term issues for us, and we'd rather find a happy home versus just any old job, or a job where they're valuing our skills over anything else, or valuing other people's skills over anything else, and then suddenly we have teammates that are kind of problematic on a long-term basis. So thanks, William. Molly, how did you come into the studio and institute some of these more kind of corporate big company policies? Tell me about selling in like the idea of and the value of values. I'm a big believer, by the way. I've worked in corporate America most of my life, and there's a lot of things that I don't like about corporate America, but I'm a big fan of these values that always provide us with kind of a North Star to inspire us, but also even help in conflict resolution and help in prioritization, things of that nature. How'd you sell that in, Molly?
Yeah, I think there's just been like a large shift in all industries, and a lot of talk about values with broader ideas of workplace inclusivity and work style shifts. There has been a trend towards talking about values, and in terms of like the skepticism there, or like the eye rolliness of that, I'm definitely first there. So it's not like I was 100% sold on establishing values as like a first thing to do at the studio, but I think we figured all together, like, let's give this a shot. And I think before we came to the realization that the values need to be established, Will was really, sure that he wanted me to speak to past collaborators and to talk to current, people that were currently on the team. Not in a call with Will, but in a call away from Will. And he encouraged me also to give them the freedom to say, listen, Will's not on this call, and Will also want you to speak freely here. So please give me feedback, on what was successful, not only about working with the studio and other people, but also working with Will, and how can we understand, how that has been successful, how that has been, could be more successful in the future. And so I think it wasn't really started about like, let's do the value, let's create the values, but rather, let me talk to the people here. And in doing that, I started to say like, well, this is something that really made this person successful with the company. This is something where we have a little bit of a hole, right? So is it that, the question then becomes, when you have like a little bit of a void or an area that's less successful, it's like, do you try and fill up that void, or do you just say, actually, that's not where our priorities are. Our priorities are on flexibility and independence, not necessarily giving, feedback 2 or 3 times a day. That's not really how the company operates. So kind of identifying where the strengths were, where there were some holes, these kind of things, and talking to people, which was something that Will really felt was important. And then from there, I think it was like, well, what are the commonalities? What are the things that made this successful in the past? And how can we kind of like shape those into what would be kind of like termed as values? And it was really, like I said, like I wasn't sold on it either. But like going through the exercise, like I think it would be like too superficial for us to create like values just based on like conversations between like me and Will, or Will and Tyler, our technical director, our management team, right? Like we really had to go, and I really had to do that talking to people part, and really like the free talking to people so that they felt comfortable to share, to really identify what the values, what made things successful, and how we can incorporate and build those values. So it was more of a process than kind of just like a checklist, if you will.
Awesome. So we've heard about flexibility and independence. What are some of the other values, or put this another way, how would you describe your company culture, your studio culture in your own words?
Is that for me or is that for Will?
Anybody that
Wanna
wants
go
to take
first?
it.
Oh, Will.
Molly, I think you should take it because you
Oh
were a
man,
big
the
part of
pressure is
spearheading
on.
that.
Okay. So, we really felt that, during one of these conversations with one of our teammates, you know, he said something so smart. He said, well, I think that each one of us would make a great game, but together we're going to make an incredible one. And I think that was like a really key, it's like so smart and so brilliant, it's like a key piece of these conversations um, that helped us develop this value of collaboration equals innovation. So really that collaboration and the collaborative process is like a key part of what we're doing, working together to make this incredible game instead of just having like a singular vision where we're making a great game. So I think that was one of our key values that came out of those conversations. Of course, the flexibility and independence. We also have well-being, which is something that I think we felt was very important, that we wanted to steer away. I think from a lot of people are doing this, but kind of steer away from the crunch. We wanted to make sure that people had the flexibility and independence to work in a way that was helpful for them. So like the well-being to like we work in a synchronous and asynchronous environment. So we have about 4 core hours that we work together, and then we have 4, the rest of the hours where people can work independently. So, creating that schedule where it's not only about like the working style, like being able to work together and then work independently, but also to, have the flexibility to have work-life balance, right? To maybe, and work preferences. Maybe you really enjoy working at 2 a.m. At night, So, okay, that is important to us, that you have the well-being to do the work the way that you want to do it, and to do the work style that you also works best for you. So I think like well-being, and then of course like intentional respect was like huge for us. Not only that we be respectful, but that we practice intentional respect, so that we see it as something, an ongoing practice that needs to be because we have people working all over in many different countries and with many different backgrounds, that we really practice that active listening, intentional respect, so that those are pretty much like our core standard values. Of course, we're still working and we're still developing. I think Will's added like 7 or 8 more to the like our tentative list. So we might end up with some more. But for right now, those are our 4 kind of like core values and what we're really focused on.
Awesome. Yeah, and you'll continue to add and iterate. Even Amazon, they have like 12 or so, 12, 15 leadership principles. And I used to work there. And while I was there for almost 4 years, they kept evolving, right? So even a big company that's been around for 20 plus years, their values, right, their leadership principles weren't set in stone, just constantly evolving and iterating for what was necessary. Intentional respect, can you actually provide a little bit more detail on what that means, or maybe an example of how that was acted out on the team?
Molly, do you want to continue with this one, or should I talk about it?
Go ahead, Will.
Yeah, for us, it's we're always giving feedback on the game, and I think oftentimes it's like, hey, this is a bug or this is not working. I think the way I see it is, when you're making a game, we try not to focus too much on the final release version, because that comes at the last day of development. The rest of the time, the game is a mess. It's broken and things need fixing. And so we want to, when we're giving feedback, it's very you want to be proactive and like understanding what people are thinking. And so it's not just like, oh, I'm not going to be mean or I'm not going to be rude. Is like, okay, I actually want to understand what was someone's approach. And so it's I think it's just like, when you're going in, it's not passively respecting. It's like, okay, I want to be take a proactive role in understanding your position and what you're thinking, and so that I can kind of make decisions accordingly.
Yeah, awesome. I've not really considered that. The intentional part is that adds a lot. That's awesome. I've been, by the way, I've just been nodding my head. This whole conversation so far. There's just so much good stuff, and I could just even hearing how you're operating or even chatting, interacting with each other here. There's just so many really positive signals of a very healthy and aspirational work environment. So this is great. I've got a couple more questions, and then we'll jump into questions from the group. You mentioned sync and async, so 4 hours overlap, 4 hours independently. What's that actually look like? Are you like in a Slack channel, in a Discord? Are you all on a video chat together? What's happening during that sync time frame?
Talk a little bit more. So it's 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Central Time, and we just found that to be, in the at least for the U.S. time zones, that's like not too late for Eastern and also not too early for Pacific. We do have one member of a team who's in the UK, but he's a bit of a night owl, so that hour works very well for him. So basically, we try to schedule all of our meetings during that time. Sometimes, it can run a little bit over if it's a really busy week, but generally that's when we have all the meetings. And so the way we treat it is from 10 to 2, if I were to message you on Slack, I would expect a response in 10 to 15 minutes, a reasonable time. Outside of those hours, I don't expect you to respond to me until the next day. So I think this way, and if you're going to be away, like people say, hey, what if I have a dentist appointment from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m.? Do I need to let you know where I'm out of office? No, because at that point, we're not expecting you to respond.
Right, okay.
So I think that is, it just means like, it's a very clear, okay, now we're on, all the other times are off. And when I was a college student, I saw this theater director, Mary Zimmerman. She's based in Chicago. She gave a talk, and somebody asked about her writing schedule. They said, when do you find the time to write? And she says, my schedule is I go to bed at 10 and I wake up at 2 in the morning, and then I write from 2 to 6. Everything's quiet. She gets a ton of that. And then she goes back to sleep, wakes up at 10 a.m. again. So it's like, we want people to have that option, because I can't do 10 to 6. I can't work for 8 hours straight. I got to take a nap. I got to go for a walk. And so we just find like 4 hours. We sort of decided that that's like the minimum amount of time we need to get all the meetings done, and to have enough flexibility. But outside of that, people can really work as they please, or when they please.
So Shane actually asked, kind of related, given that you've got a remote team, do you do any happy hours or game nights so the team can socialize together?
We don't. Molly, do you want to talk about this? We have in the past.
How do you bring folks together, I guess, and create camaraderie outside of working together?
Yeah, we do. So there are actually a couple meetings that we have that are regular. So we do these stand-up meetings on Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 10 in the morning, and also a sprint kickoff and a sprint review. So that's where a lot of the socializing happens. I think, especially with online, we've just found like sometimes the games, they're a little bit awkward, or we used to do them because especially we also don't want to make people stay later. So we would do it in that 10 a.m., 2 p.m., but oftentimes it would just mean you have a 4 hours of meeting, right? You kind of get the work meetings done, and then you do another hour social. And I think it just found it too exhausting.
Fair enough. I've had similar experiences. All right, Sad asks, I read on William's site that you worked in physics before getting into art. I was curious how this background influenced your creative work and what made you change industries.
Yeah, I went to my undergraduate studies was in physics, and I actually spent a summer working in a nuclear physics lab in Italy. It was about like an hour outside of Venice. Had a great time there. This is back in 2008. So when I was in college, I remember there were a lot of people who were interested in going to grad school. Outside of my studies, I was actually involved in a student circus. We were kind of like juggling, and that's where I learned to do the, twist balloons. And I remember my fourth
Okay.
year, I was considering going to a graduate program in physics, and I passed by my roommate. My roommate's room. He was sitting in his bed and he was reading a math textbook. And I asked him, uh, what class is that for? And he said, it's not for a class. And he's gone on to get a PhD in math. And in fact, he's a math professor now. But that moment I realized I had never, ever read a physics textbook for fun.
Yeah, yeah.
But I had a copy of Cirque du Soleil's book next to my bed, and I would read that for fun. Like I was much more interested in kind of creative work. And so that
Wow.
was this moment where I realized if I go to grad school, those are the people who are going to be around me, the people who read physics books for fun. And that's not, I'm interested, but I don't love it that much. And so kind of step back. I did, I was a street performer after I graduated, making balloon animals in parks. But I think that was sort of a wake up call for me to kind of find what it is that I'm passionate about and follow that. Now, it has been very useful in sort of process, right? You have to be very process. You have to be very detail oriented. I remember when we were working on the PS4 version, there was this bug where about an hour in, the game would crash. It was very hard to find, and we ended up creating this test suites with like different, and we would check off different features, and we would just methodically go through that until we collected enough data. And it was like being in a lab again, right? Where you have a hypothesis, and you're performing these experiments, and you just keep doing that until you have enough data that you start to see a pattern. And sure enough, we started over time to see that every time this one feature was on, after an hour, it would cause a memory leak and the game would crash, and that helped us. So there was this methodology in my studies that I would continue to use to this day.
Nice. Did you your background is like incredible. Did you, by the way, Sab, like great question, because this is really awesome insight there. The seeing the person that was so into it, so passionate about it, they're reading a textbook for fun and realizing that's not me. Right. Did your study of physics help with the juggling?
There is actually there's sort of this weird overlap between jugglers and mathematics. In fact, there's a book
Oh my gosh.
Mathematics of Juggling. It's like within the population of jugglers, there's a higher proportion of mathematicians, engineers, and physicists, and amongst mathematicians and physicists, there's a higher proportion of jugglers. So I'm not too sure what the connection is. I think in anthropologists we need to study that, but there's a lot of overlap between those communities.
Funny. I am definitely not going to be on your level. I couldn't be a street performer, but I wore gigantic pants in high school, and they had huge pockets, and I carried 3 juggling balls in my pockets, and I juggled from class to class while I was in high school. So more kindred spirits here. Ira asks, would love to hear about the team environment. How big is the team today? And then the size of the different sub-teams such as art, etc.
Sure. We currently have 5 full-time employees. So there's Molly, operations director, myself, creative director, Tyler, technical director, and then we just hired a QA tester and a producer this month. We have 4 or 5 contractors that we work with. Some of it, I say 4 or 5 because it's some of them are like on an as-needed basis. So those would be the sound designer, composer, and web designer. And then we also, Lucas is a programmer based in UK, and he works with us pretty regularly.
Cool.
So we actually don't have an art team, because like for Manifold Garden, we had art direction, but a lot of that was in the code. So that was one thing where I knew I didn't have strong art skills, and we made the game to take advantage of my strength as a programmer. So it's all in the shaders.
Right. Related, Leo asks, given that some of these roles are contract, how do you feel about those contractors having their own projects on the side? Is that harmful competition or a sign of creative drive? What's your perspective on other projects while folks are working with you?
That is a great question for Molly.
Yeah, well, we have some stipulations in our contracts, in our agreements with contractors and also employees related to that. Obviously, we don't want any competitive, other puzzle games or VR puzzle games. We don't want like the contractors or employees working on those, but we do have space, and we do encourage our team to work on their independent projects. We just have a review process to make sure that they're non-competitive. Contractors are, of course, a little bit different than employees, but basically we do encourage it, and we feel it's important just as long as it's non-competitive.
Okay, cool. While we're on that subject, what can you tell us about the new game? What are you working on now? I know it's in VR. And then actually, I guess Mark has a related question. With the studio's next project, did you immediately lean towards exploring AR, VR tech with your prototypes, or did you prototype an idea that sparked pushing into exploring the tech?
So on the topic of how much we can talk about the game, not much, except yes, it is in VR, and it is, similar themes as Manifold Garden.
William, it will be between us, our 49 people in the audience, and the 15,000 people in this Discord that we're going to share it with later.
How do we get started? Yeah, VR was not our first choice. We kind of prototyped a bunch of different things. It took I think a large part of it was really figuring out the process of prototyping. Like I said, a lot of the people joined towards the end, and kind of shipping a game. We shipped Manifold Garden on, I think, 9-10 different platforms, if you count Apple Arcade as 3 different ones. We brought it to all the consoles, but that's just such a different pattern and such a different skill set. So I think we did make a few prototypes, but it was really just to figure out, how do we start a new project as a studio? Originally, the thinking with VR was, hey, we're going to make a straight port of Manifold Garden in VR, because that is not a game 2, but a game 1.5. We kind of thought, okay, we haven't gone through the entire development cycle as a team, so maybe why don't we start with one where we have a sense of what it's about, so it isn't that big of a leap. As we started working on VR more, it's turned out to be much more of a game 2 than a game 1.5, just because with VR you really have to reinvent a lot of stuff. You can't just take, we call non-VR games pancake games, because they're flat. just to differentiate, when people say 3D, it's like 3D on a screen or 3D in VR. So for pancake games, a lot of the design, the UX, the game design, they just showed it, you have to throw it out. So you have to reinvent that. So because of that, we had to reinvent the mechanics, which means that the levels are different, which means that the puzzles are different, which means that the levels are different, and so the architecture is different. So it's starting to become much, still inspired by the same, surreal physics, architecture, infinite geometry, kind of a beautiful art style, but it's in a different direction. So I think it has the same seeds as Manifold Garden, but it's growing into a very different flower.
Sounds neat. Sounds interesting. Can't wait. All right. We've got about 10 minutes left. We've got 3 questions from the group. I've got a couple questions. I'm going to jump forward. Can you tell us a little bit more about your interview process? And then related, Zane asks, how would you filter out those that do not fit the company values early on in your application phase? So how do you assess and evaluate, and then I guess come up with your short list?
I can talk about some of the initial filtering, and then I'll hand it off to Molly to talk more about the interview process itself. So in our job listings, we always do this, which is at the bottom of the listing, we'll say, in order to apply, send an email and put this in your subject line, right? So for the illustrator position, we'll say WCS-illustrator. And immediately, and then we'll say, hey, list your hourly rate, where you based, etc. Provide references. But if we don't see that subject line, it goes into, gets labeled do not consider, because
What percentage of applications do you put into do not consider? What do you think?
the way too high. I
I
think
know,
it's
but
like 40, 50
right.
that's in, and
Yes.
the subject line is wrong, and it is heartbreaking, because some of them have really great portfolios, but we just know that if you're not reading through this thing, how can I trust you to read my feedback, or how can I trust you to
Mhm.
read my assignment? And I don't want to have that doubt. And this is just, it's not off to a good start. So that is that's the first filter we do, and it actually probably eliminates 30 to 40% of the applicant pool. I really think that it's yours to lose. Like, it's much
Mhm.
easier to um, take yourself out of running. Um, but I'll hand it off to Molly to then talk about, the people that do make it through and we like their work. How do we then start interviewing them?
Yeah, I think, part of that review where we ask for something specifically, and if it's not provided, if the exact subject line is not provided, the applicant gets weeded out, is because we already know that, like, on our team, this type of attention to detail is extremely
Mhm.
important. And if you've played Manifold Garden, you know what I mean. So it's just, we know that that type of attention to detail is a big part of what we do at the studio. So that is very important. And I think in terms of like the interview process and the conversations around the values and understanding if that is a good fit. Nate, I think you touched on this earlier. The fit has to go both ways. So it's not just in terms of our interview process, having us assess if the applicant is a good culture fit, but being transparent with the applicant when we move into the interview process about what our values are, so that they are also able to assess if that's right for them, because we do want it to go both ways. Everybody wants to get the job and win the game, but like, it's also just like, we want to be really transparent and really clear about what it's like to work with the studio, so that people can make the choice that's right for them, and we can make the choice that's right as well. So I think that's a big part. In terms of the interview process, we do interviews with every member of the management team, which is 3 currently: operations, technical, and creative. And depending on what the applicant is applying for, we kind of distribute those: first interview, second interview, third interview. Um,
Mm.
and I think the initial interview is really just about getting to know the applicant and having the applicant have like a a relaxed atmosphere in order to ask us questions. So it's a really relaxed meeting. Once the applicant has been selected for that interview process, we really try and keep that first one relaxed. The second one, depending on, we do a lot of note taking and shared note taking and communication between the management, operations, and technical, so that the second interview is a little bit more focused. And then, of course, the third will focus on any remaining questions or things that we want to like target focus. And I think that's, how we kind of like work together collaboratively as a team to understand and get different people's point of view. I think when we started to put the management team together, it was very important to Will that we have kind of like no longer like a Will who has to make all the decisions, but a management team who can make decisions with different points of view and different perspective. And that, in terms of like, that filters over to our interview process and is really important for like seeing 360. Good culture fit, do they have the proper skill set, what is their background, etc., all of that. So I think that's been our interview process thus far, and it has worked, quite well. And we hope to, again, iterate, make it better for the future, etc.
I would love to talk more about this, and maybe even share some of your learnings and best practices with other smaller indie studios that are just starting to figure this stuff out. Because again, it sounds like you've thought about this, you've got some experience here, and it sounds like a very solid process. I want to ask about, you mentioned over email writing an employee handbook. Are you writing one? Do you have one? What's going
We
on there?
wrote one. We wrote one.
Awesome.
Yeah, we wrote one. It was, you know, I think again, I have to say a lot of, a lot of this credit, like I did a lot of the writing, but a lot of this credit goes to Will giving the space and the time and the dedication to actually making an employee handbook and not putting it to
Mm-hmm.
the side as something that happens in operations, but really saying like, this is important. We need to make this, we need to
Mm-hmm.
establish this. Let's make the time and space for this to happen. And, contributing as well, like from Will's perspective and from everyone's perspective into like making this handbook. But yeah, we made, I think it's like a 45-page handbook. We used, what was it we used as a reference, Will?
We use there were a couple of different references, but a big inspiration was Valve's
Yeah.
Yeah.
handbook. Just they covered so much, and it's the presentation is beautiful. Ours doesn't have the drawings. We'll a later iteration, but yeah, that was kind of one of the inspirations.
Yeah, and one of the things we do, we just onboarded 2 new employees, is we almost have like a week for review of that handbook. I know it sounds like a lot,
Nice.
but a review of the handbook and the tools and all these kinds of things, but really to give that space to say like, yeah, culture fit is a really important thing for us. It's not read the handbook like in your free time, but like we're giving the time also to like have the time to spend with this document. But again, we want to make it a little bit more fun, add some illustrations and stuff like that. But we're on our first version of it. We finished it.
Awesome.
Yeah,
I
the
love that.
way I just sorry, go on, Nate.
No, go ahead, Will.
I was just gonna add like that first week the way we onboard is and giving people time to read the handbook is because we want you to be a member of the team first and your
Mm-hmm.
role second. Like, we figured, hey, if someone is a QA tester and that first week we're already giving them QA tasks, it's sort of saying like, okay, um, the employee handbook then becomes secondary because that just
Yes.
doesn't feel as important as do a QA report of this, but we want you to know how, like, what our cultures are, how do we work, how to take days off, how to request PTO, sick days, stuff like that. We want you to have the space and time to become familiar before we start adding the actual tasks you're going to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. A very deliberate, I guess one of your words, intentional kind of onboarding process. In my worlds, like I don't want people doing anything for at least the first week, and the things that they are doing. It's usually around kind of building some of those muscles or just learning some of the internal tools, right? Like I might ask you during an onboarding process to schedule your first vacation, right? And that will help you understand like my emphasis towards your need to take time off, right, while also learning some of those tools. But I love that you're creating that space. We are out of time. We do have a couple other questions. I'm not gonna you're free to run off, but if you're open to staying another couple minutes to finish up these questions, we can do that. I will also ask, I know you want to put some illustrations. Would the handbook be something that you're willing to release publicly, either today or in the future?
Ooh, I would love to. I mean, we'd want to, just maybe there's some confidential information we want to sort out, but yeah, we're really proud of it. Molly spearheaded that project, and I think and honestly, it's such it really makes a good impression. I think one of the producer we just hired, who found the job through work with indies,
Awesome.
one of during the when it came down to deciding whether you want to take the job or not, actually asked to look at the employee handbook, and we sent it to him. And kind of reading that really gave him a good impression or an accurate impression of like who we are as a company. So
Yeah, I love it for multiple reasons. Selfishly, again, I'd love to share it as a best practice with other studios. Also, I'd be happy to, kind of display it or even write up my own kind of summary or article and have that show up on all your job pages, right? So for additional information and hopefully inspiration for others to apply for your jobs. And again, also kind of weed themselves out, right? If they read the handbook and they realize that it's not a cultural fit. So at some point, if and when you're ready and scrubbed as necessary, I'd love to be able to share that. How are you two doing on time? Do you have a couple minutes? You need to run. You could please feel free to run.
We've got a couple minutes, Molly. What do you? I think we
Yeah,
probably
got a
take like
couple
one or two
minutes. Yeah.
questions.
Okay, we'll only have we have just two questions here, Ben and Willie. So Ben asks, so you're using, I believe you're using Unity today, right? Would you consider using the witness model and creating your own in-house game engine? What's your perspective on the value cost equation of creating your own game engine?
We would not create our own game engine. I mean, even there's one, I don't have experience writing my own engine, so that's not, and I don't. Tyler might, but uh, not. I think he's always used an engine in his. I know he's worked on proprietary engines that are not Unity or Unreal in the past, but I don't know if he's sort of written his own. I think for us, it's really hard to. I mean, I think from the economics of it, it's really hard to justify not using Unreal, right? Because Epic is essentially giving you the tools that they're using to make Fortnite. So that's an incredibly
Yeah,
uh, large company spending a ton of resources on a incredibly successful game, and they're just letting you use that tool. Now there is a revenue share, but I just can't see how um, on our own we'd be able to catch up to that. And especially on Manifold Garden, we brought that game to it runs on iPod Touch all the way up to PS5. And so there is a very wide range of platforms it's running on, and a lot of that is thanks to what Unity provides. We did have to do a lot of work on top of that, but we were really standing on the shoulder of giants there to pull it off.
right. Yeah, and then there's also just the benefit of people coming in and knowing the engine right from day one versus having to ramp up on your own internal engine.
That's
Also,
another
yeah,
great point when it comes to hiring. Yes.
yeah, and the fact, like you mentioned, iPod Plus. Like I'm working with a studio that does work with their own engines, and um, bringing things to mobile, right? That's just really hard at this point, right? So I'm passing up on a lot of like what would be really great opportunities because it looks like it would take us years.
Yeah, we brought Manifold Garden to mobile in 3 months. The Apple Arcade, I think we signed that contract June 2019, and we came out October 2019. So that would not have been possible had we not had a lot of existing tools, and also
Yeah,
had we brought on other studios to help us, but they were already familiar with Unity. If they had to learn our own engine, I don't know, it might have taken a year and a half. We would have missed that window.
right, right. All right, Willie, last question here. Going along with the thought of flexibility being a core value, I was curious of your methodology building levels and concepts for this follow-up game, if that has become more flexible now that you're starting with a solid team of folks. The question here is really, are members of the team bouncing ideas off of each other? Do you still look at works of MC Escher for initial inspiration? What's the creative process look like now on the team? And I thought that was cool because I also saw in one of your job descriptions that you're looking for people that are both independent, self-motivated, wanting to become experts, at their field, but you're also looking for people that are comfortable working in an iterative creative process and strong creative direction, right? So Manifold Garden also obviously had very strong creative direction. Can you tell us a little bit more about the dynamics in the creative between the team and about a little bit about this iterative process that you have today?
That is a great question, and something we actually have been very intentional about. So one of the things that we're all following as a studio is Richard Lemarchand's book, A Playful Production Process. Richard
Mm-hmm.
worked at Naughty Dog for many years, and I believe he's a professor at USC, but he wrote this book. He calls it a book on production for designers. And um, we actually, in fact, when somebody joins the team, we send them a copy of it. That's how much we
Right.
love the book.
Yeah.
And one of the things he talks about is setting aside, being very clear about the pre-production process and production. So during pre-production, there's ideation. And one of the things, when we started working on this project, we were also asking for funding at the same time. So there wasn't a clear um, separation of what stage we were in. One of the things we did after reading A Playful Production was we went back and we said, okay, we're going to go back to doing pre-production, and we're going to have a dedicated time for ideation. Anybody can come and present an idea that they have. We really believe that good design can come from anyone. Like everybody has good ideas. You don't need to be a designer. That being said, we also make it very, very clear that the designer is the one who has to make the final call. It's not that, we definitely in the past have struggled with people feeling like their ideas weren't heard because they weren't implemented. And so one of the things we were very careful about is like everybody is heard, but these are the key decision makers, because we're not making a game. It's not a democratic process where the majority decides, right? The way we see it is like everybody's idea is heard, but then we choose the best one and everybody gets on board with that.
Awesome. What do you have any other books that you send out during the onboarding phase?
We haven't found another one that we really like. We did like when our producer joined, he already had a copy of it. But we just think that it's such a great book because it talks about crunch, it talks about work-life balance. Like we're proud to say this book represents, the way we approach things is a little bit different, but I think it really captures the spirit and the approach that we want to go for.
Have you read Spelunky, Derek Hughes' boss fight book?
I have not. I really should.
Okay, yeah, I highly recommend. I just thought it was just really fascinating. Inside the mind of an incredible game developer, right? Designers, right? So that I would highly recommend that you check out. I just loved it. It's one of my must reads. I feel like everybody in games should read it. Will, Molly, this was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much. I wish we had a few more hours. Believe it or not, I rushed through some questions. I would have loved to went into more of the nitty gritty and details. It's kind of what I do. But we had to move on because there was so much good stuff to cover. But again, really enjoyed the conversation. You sound like a lovely team and studio and culture that I think our audience would really enjoy being a part of and aspire to being a part of. So again, thanks for joining us, spending all this time sharing these insights. And I hope we can all stay in touch so we can share more and more of these insights going forward and continue to help everybody here and all of our indie developers kind of level up as employees, as leaders and as studios.
Thanks so much for having us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so
All right.
much.
Thanks everybody for joining. I will do what I can to try to take this transcription, which is going to spit out a few thousand words, and put it into something that is presentable in an article, and we'll try to get that up in the next few days because we know that we're also up against a time crunch as your open roles are closing, I believe, on the 3rd. So if this was informative and inspiring to you, you've got a few days to put a high quality application together. Remember that subject line, very, very important to getting past the first step, and get those apps in. And everybody, good luck.
Good luck,
William, Molly,
everyone.
I will end the stage here. We can jump into Green Room and chat if you would like. Otherwise, have a fantastic day, and we'll talk again soon.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.